Federalist Papers 73, Part 2, third paragraph. The last of the requisite to energy which have been enumerated are competent powers. Let us proceed to consider those which are proposed to be vested in the President of the United States. If you haven't watched Part 1, please do so before we continue. The first thing that offers itself to our observation is the qualified negative of the President upon the acts or resolutions of the two houses of the legislature, or in other words, his power of returning all bills with objections, to have the effect of preventing their becoming laws unless they should afterwards be ratified by 2/3 of each of the component members of the legislative body. So the President can veto laws, and the legislature, 2/3 of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate, can override this veto. The propensity of the legislative department to intrude upon the rights and to absorb the powers of the other departments has been already more than once suggested. The insufficiency of a mere parchment delineation of the boundaries of each has also been remarked upon, and the necessity of furnishing each with constitutional arms for its own defense has been inferred and approved. From these clear and indubitable principles result the propriety of a negative, either absolute or qualified, in the executive upon the acts of the legislative branches. Without the one or the other, the former would be absolutely unable to defend himself against the depredations of the latter. He might gradually be stripped of his authorities by successive resolutions or annihilated by a single vote, and in the one mode or the latter or the other, the legislative and executive power may speedily come to be blended in the same hands. So we've given this veto power to the President to make sure that the legislature, as we know in republics, the legislature can actually absorb a lot of power. We want to keep the separation of powers and balance of power in check. We don't want the legislature to overwhelm the President. Because of that, we've given him this veto power. If even no propensity had ever discovered itself in the legislative body to invade the rights of the executive, the rules of just reasoning and theoretic propriety would of themselves teach us that the one ought not to be left at the mercy of the other, but ought to possess a constitutional and effectual power of self-defense. We're not going to imagine, just do wishful thinking that, no, the legislature, this is a republic, people are going to be enlightened, legislature is not going to overstep its bounds. And Hamilton says you're crazy if you think this. Human beings with power get corrupted. I don't care who it is. So we better put this in the Constitution and make it effectual. In other words, it can do its job. It's not an imaginary thing. When the time comes, you say, this is what the Constitution says, and I need to defend my branch of the government. Next paragraph, but the power in question has a further use. It not only serves as a shield to the executive, but it furnishes an additional security against the inaction of improper laws. It establishes a salutary check upon the legislative body calculated to guard the community against the effects of faction, precipitancy, or of any impulse unfriendly to the public good, which may happen to influence a majority of that body. And let's say people out of emotion, people in the States out of emotion not really based on reason, because there are rumors out there. They just get in a state of frenzy, and let's say 51% of them decides they want to tell their representatives, you need to pass these laws. He says, this provision actually gives the president, who we are hoping is a wiser person, to have been elected for 4 years, to have been given this extremely important responsibility. He will say, no, this is wrong. What you're doing, what you're planning to do is going to cause us a lot of headache in the long run. I'm going to veto it. Even though 51% of people, 55% of people say it needs to be done, I think it's unwise. People, their emotions have got the better of them. Just because you're elected to the House of Representatives, it doesn't mean you're right. Because if the people are wrong and they're telling you to vote some way, and you actually, without thinking and reason, follow what they say, then somebody's got to check you, and because in the long run, people will learn to appreciate that we did the wise thing. The propriety of a negative has upon some occasions been combated by an observation that it was not to be presumed a single man would possess more virtue or wisdom than a number of men, and that unless this presumption should be entertained, it would be improper to give the executive magistrate any species of control over the legislative body. But this observation, when examined, will appear rather specious than solid. The propriety of the thing does not turn upon the supposition of superior wisdom or virtue in the executive, but upon the supposition that the legislative will not be infallible. We are not saying the president is smarter and more powerful, should be more powerful than the legislative branch. We're not saying that. But we are saying that members of the House of Representatives, even the Senate, are not wise at all times. We just cannot count on them being wise and act wisely 100% of time. They are not infallible, he says. That the love of power may sometimes betray it into a disposition to encroach upon the rights of the other members of the government. So see, anybody with power can be corrupted, and because of that, we've put this emergency provision in the Constitution. That a spirit of faction may sometimes pervert its deliberations, that impressions of moment may sometimes harry it into measures which itself on mature reflection would condemn. The primary inducement to conferring the power in question upon the executive is to enable him to defend himself. The secondary one is to increase the chances in favor of the community against the passing of bad laws through haste, inadvertence, or design. The oftener a measure is brought under examination, the greater the diversity in the situation of those who are to examine it, the less must be the danger of those errors which flow from want of a due deliberation, or of those missteps which proceed from the contagion of some common passion or interest. See, he uses the word contagion as if it's a disease. These passions and interests take over the population, and then it reflects in the House of Representatives, even in the Senate, and then it destroys our form of Republican government. The oftener, I'll repeat this line, the oftener a measure is brought under examination, the greater the diversity in the situations of those who are to examine it. The less must be the danger of those errors which flow from want of due deliberation, or of those missteps which proceed from the contagion of some common passion or interest. It is far less probable that culpable views of any kind should infect all parts of the government at the same moment and in relation to the same subject, then that they should be turns, govern, and mislead every one of them. So we've got this balance of power, checks and balances, separation of powers, just to make sure that one branch of the government does not ruin the work of the government, the future of the country, because momentary passions have taken over the people and they want to pass laws that is detrimental to the future happiness of the country. Let's say there's a rumor that members of one religion, the minority religion, have done something wrong. And the majority, let's say 51% of the people who are of the majority religion decide they're going to pass laws that in the long run would be totally disastrous to their future happiness. But passions have taken over, emotions have taken over, and they might tell their representatives and senators to pass laws. Here, the president, when he knows he has to deal with the outside world, with people maybe in countries that are of the same religious background, or things that might damage the future standing of the country in the eyes of other people, the president might veto it and say, no, you need to think about this. Maybe this is a rumor. Maybe this is just say so. We don't know. So that's why this power has been given, this provision gives this power to the president in this constitution that we want you to ratify.